All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. We have a special guest for you again today. Jonathan Fasano from SREC Trade is joining us. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about how the SREC program works in Maryland and in Washington, D.C. Now, these are two of the top SREC markets or most popular SREC markets in the country. And for those of you who've seen the previous video, you'll know that the SRECs are an additional way that you can help monetize and have that investment in solar pay back for you. So Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us on the channel today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Joe.
Yeah, so for those of, I guess for those in the audience that have not heard of the SREC program or not familiar with Maryland and DC, can you kind of just start out by telling us how do SRECs work and what is it all about?
Yeah, so SRECs are essentially, well, it stands for Solar Renewable Energy Certificates or credits, pretty interchangeable there. These credits are monetized incentives for the generation that you produce or the energy that you produce with your solar system. And they are measured, the credits are actually quantified by every 1,000 kilowatt hours that a system might generate. And also known as like 1 megawatt hour, if you will. And so the establishment of these programs is ultimately for states, counties, cities to be more renewable. And the way that the mandates are implemented is that utility companies per state are required to deliver a certain amount of renewable generated energy to their customers on an annual basis, which is like the energy year or the compliance year. And so if they fall short of what is required of them to deliver, then they have to pay ultimately a penalty fee. And so they're able to purchase these certificates from generators of renewable energy, such as solar system owners, to avoid the penalty fees and pay a slightly lower or more effective cost in terms of purchasing from their actual customers instead of paying the penalty fee that's been implemented. So a number of different ways to generate these renewable energy certificates. The one that we are focusing on is the SRECs that you mentioned, which are solar. So we kind of consider those to be in the embodiment of the solar carve out within the mandates. And the overarching like umbrella of the mandate is considered the RPS, or the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So these renewable energy sources could be wind, could be hydro, geothermal, things of that nature. But the solar carve-outs specifically are, of course, what we manage at SREC Trade and what we'll be talking about today as well.
Great. Now, who's eligible to receive these SREC credits? Is this anybody that has solar panels on their home, or are there any specific requirements?
Yeah, great question. So the two main territories or participants in solar credit, I guess the solar credit industry, are within a territory called NEPOOL, which is going to be kind of your New England territories, and then PJM GATS. PJM GATS is a territory, I believe, of about 12 different states, with like a little sliver of North Carolina being in there. But when PJM GATS is ultimately, I like to call it the final checks and balances of what your system is generating is said to be true. And it involves states that are part of this RPS that have a specific solar carve out. So for instance, Colorado seems like it would be a really great state for solar energy and to be able to sell credits, but Colorado doesn't participate in the solar carve out of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So most East Coast states are where these incentives are built out. And we can, show a PJM GATS territory map of participating states, as well as NEPOOL on a separate hand. But it's only about 10 different states that can participate in this solar carve out. And it is program by program. So if you're in one state that might not have a specific program, but you're in the PJM GATS territory, you can actually sell into another state, being Pennsylvania, in a subsequent program that they've established. So there's a lot of different ins and outs when it comes to the ability to sell your solar credits. And if you ever have any questions, you can feel free to give us a call at SREC Trade, and we'll help identify if you are in fact eligible, whether it's in your state or by selling into a program like the secondary Pennsylvania program.
Right. No, because I remember when I was, installing solar here in Virginia, up until about 2017, 2018, we were able to register our Virginia solar homeowners onto the Pennsylvania SREC market. But, in today's program, we're talking primarily about Maryland and also Washington, D.C., which have some of the highest SREC prices from what I've seen. Why is the SREC program so much more lucrative in Maryland and in Washington, D.C. than in other parts of the country?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's one of the burning questions for most Maryland residents, being so close to DC, and we get a lot of inquiries about can I sell into the DC market, considering that it's a much higher price, as you pointed out, and it's again, program by program, how it's established within the jurisdictions of the state or the city like DC, and it's ultimately based upon what we call the alternative compliance payment. This can be found on our website, on our individual market pages. It's identified as the SACP, or Solar Alternative Compliance Payment. And it can be seen as that penalty fee that I was discussing before. So let's say in DC, you have Pepco as the main utility company. If Pepco fails to deliver the percentage that's required of them of solar renewable energy that they need to deliver to their customers, for every megawatt hour that they fall short, they have to pay a penalty fee that's been put in place. And it's simply that the penalty fee in DC is significantly higher. I believe at the moment it's $500, and that will change. And this information can be found on our website with our market requirements chart. Whereas in Maryland, for the Maryland utility companies that are mandated by the state, their penalty fees are much lower. So for example, just last year, the SACP, or alternative compliance payment, was at $80 per megawatt hour, in March of this year, it was lowered to $60. And that follows, again, the energy year that we were kind of mentioning a little bit earlier on. And so it's really just how the program is established, but that penalty fee really can be seen as like the ceiling or the soft limit of what an SREC might be valued at. And then from there, it's really all a matter of supply and demand. So at the moment at SREC Trade, we are able to transact pretty close to that $60 mark. And, we're sitting at May 27th, 2022 at the moment, which is the reason we're able to transact at that close to that $60 mark is because Maryland is significantly undersupplied based on the percentage required of solar energy that utility companies need to deliver. DC at the moment, we've seen some pretty drastic changes there this year for a couple of reasons, but they are transacting closer to about the $330 to $350 range, even though the penalty fee is at $500. It's mainly because the DC market is vastly oversupplied. And then, it comes down to payment timing as well, which we can go into, whenever you'd like. That kind of factors into the expectations, of when people might receive the payments for these incentives too.
Sure. So right now, if I'm understanding you correctly, though, you're saying Maryland SRECs are trading at about $60. In Washington, D.C., though, about $350 per credit?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, so let's say if I'm a homeowner, if I'm a solar homeowner in one of those two states, let's say I just went solar, I just got my solar panels turned on, what could I expect in terms of when could I actually begin to receive payments for these credits?
So it might take a little bit longer than one would anticipate originally. And this is due to a couple factors. The main things being that we in our power are doing everything that we can to process your applications once they arrive in our inbox, if you will. But we are at the mercy of the Public Service Commissions for approval and the National Tracking Registry that I referenced before, which is called PJM GATS for the DC, Maryland territory specifically. And so even though a homeowner who has just gone through the rigorous process of getting solar on their home, getting it approved by their utility company, and they can finally switch it on after getting that utility signature on their interconnection agreement or their certificate of completion, there is a secondary process to actually register your system to make it eligible for selling SRECs. So the first step is to submit the application. Actually, excuse me, let me back up a second. The first step is to vet the application that arrives on our website. And this goes for any aggregator that might be out there of SRECs. The documentation requirements of the state, we will vet those details and make sure that the application has everything that it needs. And so let's say a simple, clean application that is submitted, gets submitted within a week of receiving it on our site. We submit that to the Public Service Commission, be it DC or Maryland. And then it can take anywhere from 2 weeks to we've even seen 6 weeks for approval, depending upon certain backlogs or time of year, things of that sort. So right now, let's say we're sitting at roughly about 7 weeks at this point. So almost 2 months. And then once we get approval there, we will submit to the National Tracking Registry. So the National Tracking Registry will cross-reference what is on the application on our website and what has been registered and certified with the Public Service Commission of the respective state. And then they will be able to approve that. And that can take about another 2 weeks or so. So on average, I'd say from application on our site to being approved to sell SRECs, it can take about 2.5 months. And then from there, it's all about reporting your generation. So it's important to note that if your system was interconnected in the same year that it is certified for by the state and the National Tracking Registry, you will get credit of your generation due back to when you were interconnected that year. If by chance you were interconnected in, let's say, December of 2021, but you didn't submit your application until March of 2022, you would only receive generation credit due back to January 1st of 2022. So it is very important, especially for those systems that become interconnected closer to the end of the year, that you submit your applications as soon as possible in order to get them certified in the same year that you were interconnected, so you can receive that generation. So at this point, we're at, let's say, roughly 2 months for certification with the state and the tracking registry. And then it's going to take about another half a month to a month to report all of the generation that you accumulated during that downtime. As I mentioned, you're not going to lose that if it's in the same year as you were interconnected and certified. And so it does just take time to register that generation and get it approved by the tracking registry. So we're obtaining certifications. We are then ultimately reporting the generation of your system, but that generation, again, needs to be verified by the tracking registry, as I say, the final checks and balances of what your system should be generating based upon its capacity of panels and wattage, and it's actually true of what you've reported. And so that's essentially how these credits are tracked. And then we will mint those credits when they become available. And then eventually we will bring them to a spot trade in order to sell. And so when it comes to selling credits, there's a number of different ways that you can go about that as well. We actually offer our clients 3 main ways of selling their credits. But on average, it's going to take in Maryland, it's a much shorter amount of time. In DC, it can be a little bit longer due to the number of buyers that you have in each market. And so all said and done, I would say a reasonable expectation of time between submitting your application on our website and receiving your first payment could be anywhere from 3 to 4 months when you see that deposit finally land in your account for the SRECs that you've generated.
Okay, but that's not too bad compared to some of the other things. I know many folks, depending on timing, may have to wait up to a year to get the tax credit, the solar tax credit back. But Now, I know you mentioned monitoring and tracking several times. So how does the tracking registry know how much solar you're generating? Does the homeowner just report it based on what they see on the monitoring app? Or is there some kind of tie-in between the solar equipment and where it reports back to your website or back to the, how does that whole thing work?
Yeah, really great question. So, and you hit the nail on the head. So there's two main options, being manual reporting for one, which is where on our portal, they have the ability to access all the information from production to their transaction statements, and again, the control over how their SRECs are sold. And so in the production tab, if you have a meter or a solar monitor that's not API compatible with our system, you can jump in between the 1st and the 15th of the month to enter your production. And so let's say it is, May 27th right now. When we get to June, on June 1st until the 15th, you would jump into the website. You would put in your production that most likely the lifetime production or cumulative production that will report for the month of May. And so it's always going to be a month behind because your system, needs to generate it first before it can be reported. Once we receive that, we will submit it to the tracking registry for verification, and then the subsequent minting and payment of the SRECs after taking them to market. So that's the manual reporting option. We do have an automatic API set up with two of the devices actually that you featured on your website or on your channel a while ago, being Enphase and SolarEdge. Those are the two main devices that auto reporting is the most efficient and simplified. So what will happen is during the application process and the certification process of the system, we can have the APIs set up to those devices depending upon which one the solar system might have. And this allows for automatic reporting on a monthly basis. I like to say it's, a very set it and forget it type of setup. And, ultimately it comes down to the less a client interacts with us or we interact with a client, the better things are going. That means everything is operating smoothly. And it can definitely be the case when we have those APIs set up with the Enphase or SolarEdge meters.
Great. Okay. So if you're doing Enphase or SolarEdge out there, which is the majority of the systems that we're working on here, Solar Surge, then you can set up automatic reporting between the SREC platform and your monitoring.
Yep, exactly.
So, okay. Well, I think that answers probably most of the questions. In terms of price fluctuations, I know we talked earlier about, $60 right now per credit in Maryland, 350 or so in DC. What kind of volatility are you seeing in SREC prices? Is it pretty steady, or can these prices go all over the place?
So for the most part, compared to like stock prices, they are relatively steady. And I say relatively because you can see fluctuations. And again, it comes down to the relationship of supply and demand. So with the penalty fee that we mentioned before, we kind of have our set ceiling. But then in the instance of Maryland, with a very undersupplied market, the pricing is pretty close to that penalty fee at $60. Whereas with DC right now, it's a very oversupplied market. And so we've, in the past couple of months, seen a pretty significant drop from the, close to 400 that we were transacting at previously to, again, about 330 to 350 that we're transacting at currently. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to payments is that a Maryland resident might see payments more regularly than a DC resident. And this is due to the fact that DC only has one compliance buyer, and that's ultimately going to be Pepco. And so Pepco, as the sole utility provider in DC, is only required to deliver what's mandated by them, but there are no other utility companies in the city that have to meet these requirements. So they almost have a monopoly over the SREC purchasing, if you will. And so they control kind of the schedule, Whereas in Maryland, there are multiple buyers of these SRECs. And so you might have multiple more frequent spot trades throughout the year. We kind of touched upon a little bit the energy year or the compliance year. And so the compliance year just ended in April of this year for DC. And so because it ended then, they're not really pressed at the moment to fulfill the percent requirement of solar energy to deliver. And so we've actually seen a lag in purchasing of the SRECs, and that's pretty typical for the DC market. Once April hits, it slows down quite a bit. Towards the end of the year, you'll see more purchasing happening from Pepco ultimately, or the compliance buyer. Whereas Maryland, because you have a lot more utility companies that are mandated to fulfill these requirements, you have more frequent purchasing throughout the year, in addition to the fact that the market itself is undersupplied. And ultimately, the undersupply comes from the fact that on our website, under that market requirements page, you can also see in the middle column of that chart is the percent solar requirement. And so for the state of Maryland, it is relatively high in the year 2022. 5.5% of the overall RPS is coming from solar. And so that does make the market quite undersupplied versus DC, where let me see real quick. So the percent solar requirement in DC, for example, in 2022 is 2.6%. And if you think about the size of DC versus the size of Maryland, and actually how much solar you can actually have on buildings there are a significant amount of people who do have solar systems in the district. And so that being an oversupplied market is what brings that price down. So between each individual transaction, you might not see too much fluctuation, but over the course of the year, you can see a significant dip like we've seen earlier this year.
Got it. Well, I mean, even with it being oversupplied, though, I mean, I can see if you're a homeowner in Washington, D.C., even with a modest sized solar system, though, you could be generating an extra $300 or $400, maybe even $500 a month on a large home, extra income on top of, the electric bill savings, which is incredible. I mean, in terms of a dollar for dollar payback, it makes it almost a no-brainer to go solar if you're living in Washington, D.C., or even Maryland, to a lesser extent, but still a very profitable investment. Yeah,
absolutely. If you're in DC and let's say, for example, you have a modest home at 1,200 to 1,500 square feet, you've got a 4 to 6 kilowatt size system. Between the cost of the system and the return on the SRECs, it's pretty much a break even. In the summertime, you're not going to be paying anything for your utility bill, essentially just mostly the delivery charge. And then over the annual accumulation of those SRECs, whether you're getting paid out for, all 6 or 7 that you might get late in the year, or, as you were mentioning, month by month, it does, it gives you just that nice break-even baseline until the system's paid off. And then once, the system's paid off, you're able to really just to take that generated revenue and put it towards your utility bill and pretty much eliminate it completely.
Yeah. Well, folks, this has been an introduction to the Maryland and the Washington, D.C. SREC program. Of course, if you're interested in getting more information about solar in those two states, or if you're a solar homeowner anywhere in the Northeast and you haven't looked into an SREC trading account yet, then we're going to send you to srectrade.com, where you can get signed up right there on the website, and they will help you, give you again an additional way to monetize this investment that you've made in solar, or if you're considering it, this investment that you're considering in solar power. Well, Jonathan, is there anything else that the audience should know about SREC Trade or about the program in Maryland or in Washington, D.C. Before we end the video?
Yeah, I would love to touch upon one last thing, and that is the DC feeder line that can be found. which interestingly enough, when Pepco built out their utility lines, it actually went over the border into Maryland a bit. And so that results in the fact that if you're pretty close to the DC border in Maryland, you might be eligible for DC SRECs. So we can provide a link to the site to find out if you're thinking about solar, or if you have solar already and you're not enrolled for those DC SRECs. Here at SREC Trade, we can help you get enrolled. But it's a really huge added benefit being a Maryland resident, with all of the tax rebates and state incentives that you get there, in addition to the ability to redeem DC SRECs. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us at any time at SREC Trade. You can visit our website, find our phone numbers, or shoot us an email. It's dc.renewables@srectrade.com or md.renewables@srectrade.com, depending upon what state you're in. But ultimately, Joe, I really appreciate you having us here on Solar Surge, and the relationship that we've been able to build, just making the area and the country as green as we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is going to be very valuable information for the audience, people that are considering the investment in solar. I know a lot of times, a solar sales representative may not have this kind of information or this level of detail of how the program works, but it could have massive implications for a system owner to make sure that they actually are getting their maximum payback on their investment in solar.
Yeah, that's a great point to make. Is I often say that at SREC Trade we are very much the middleman, helping with the aggregation and sale of SRECs that are very difficult to do on a singular level. But our goal here is really to help make the most of a client's investments that they've already put a lot of money towards, and we're trying to make that go as far as you possibly can.
Absolutely. Well, Jonathan, we thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise with the audience here. Folks, as always, I'm Joe Ordia, encouraging you to get prepared and be empowered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.